The notary's pen was already moving when I grabbed his wrist and said, "Don't." My uncle froze. The woman sitting across the table, my mother, barely 60, her eyes glassy and unfocused, blinked like she'd just been woken from something. The notary looked between us. My uncle's jaw tightened. And in that single suspended second, I watched him understand that the version of me he'd been managing for the past 14 months, the grieving daughter, the overwhelmed caretaker, the one too busy with hospital visits to read the fine print, was gone. I had spent weeks becoming someone he didn't expect. But I should start at the beginning. Or rather, I should start where I was standing when I realized there was no version of this that ended quietly. My father died on a Tuesday in late October. Not suddenly, he'd been sick for almost 2 years, the kind of slow decline that changes everything so gradually you stop noticing it until one morning you wake up and the house sounds completely different, emptier. Like a room where someone forgot to turn off a fan and then finally did. He was 63. He'd worked the same job for 30 years, saved carefully, bought the house outright, and spent the last decade telling me and my mother that we'd be taken care of. He meant it. He'd planned for it. I know that now more than I knew it then. I'm in my early 30s. My name is Claire. I work in healthcare administration, which means I understand paperwork better than most people and trust it less than almost anyone. At the time of my father's death, I was living 40 minutes away, close enough to come quickly, far enough to have my own life. I drove over every weekend the last year of his illness. I learned what his good days looked like and what his bad ones felt like. I held his hand the morning he passed. My uncle arrived that same afternoon. He was my father's younger brother, 8 years between them, the kind of sibling relationship that looked close from the outside and revealed its cracks slowly. My uncle had always been charming in that particular way that makes you feel seen until you realize he's the same with everyone: servers, neighbors, strangers at gas stations. The warmth is real, but it costs nothing, which means it means nothing. My father used to say his brother could sell a man his own wallet. He said it fondly. I filed it away. That first week, my uncle was exactly what you'd hope for. He handled the funeral arrangements with quiet efficiency. He fielded calls from relatives I barely recognized. He brought groceries without being asked and made himself scarce when my mother needed to cry. He stayed in the guest room, just temporarily, just until things settled. Temporarily lasted 14 months. Looking back, I can trace the shift almost to the week. It started the way these things always do, with something small and reasonable. My mother was overwhelmed. The estate was more complicated than expected. There were accounts my father had managed alone, policies she didn't fully understand, a property tax situation that needed attention. My uncle said he'd help sort it out. He had some experience with these things, he said. He just wanted to make sure she wasn't taken advantage of. He used that phrase a lot, taken advantage of. I was grateful at first. I was working full-time, managing my own apartment and my mother's needs simultaneously, running on 3 hours of sleep and cold coffee. When my uncle said he'd handle the financials, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. I thanked him. I told my mother how lucky we were. I think about that sometimes, how I handed him the door and called it luck. My mother started declining around month 3. I noticed it the way you notice weather changing, not the moment it shifts, but the cumulative difference between one week and the next. She'd always been sharp, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthdays without a calendar and could recite grocery prices from 3 different stores. Then she started forgetting small things. Then medium things. Then she'd look at me mid-conversation with this brief blankness, like a screen going dark before rebooting, and by the time she came back, she'd lost the thread. My uncle blamed grief. He said it gently, with the right amount of concern in his voice. He'd read somewhere that bereavement affected cognition, especially in older women. He'd started making her herbal tea every evening, a blend he ordered online, specifically formulated for sleep and anxiety. He showed me the label once. It looked legitimate. I didn't research it. I visited every Sunday. My uncle was always there, always helpful, always slightly in the way without appearing to be. He'd answer questions before my mother could. He'd redirect conversations that lingered too long on finances. When I asked about specific accounts, he'd say they were still being organized and change the subject with the kind of smoothness that doesn't register as evasion until you're already talking about something else. The first thing that genuinely stopped me was a property tax bill. I'd picked up the mail by accident. My mother had asked me to grab it on my way in, and I noticed the amount. It was higher than it should have been. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The kind of discrepancy that means either a mistake or a change. When I asked my uncle about it later, he said the county had reassessed. He explained it in enough detail that I nodded and moved on. But I'm in healthcare administration. I understand what it means when numbers don't match the story attached to them. That night, I went home and pulled up the county assessor's website. The reassessment he described hadn't happened. The tax increase corresponded to something else, a change in ownership classification. A technical adjustment that only occurs when a property's deed has been modified. I sat very still for a long time. Then I called a friend from college who worked at a title company. I kept it casual, hypothetical. I asked her how property deed changes showed up in the public record and how quickly. She told me. I thanked her and hung up. The next morning I went to the county recorder's office before work. My father's house, the one my parents had owned for 27 years, the one my father had paid off, the one he'd specifically left to my mother in his will, had been quietly transferred into a joint trust 8 weeks earlier. My mother's name was on it. So was my uncle's. My mother's signature was there. I stared at it for a long time. It looked like her handwriting, but compressed, like someone copying the shape of letters they'd studied but didn't quite feel. I photographed everything and drove to work. I didn't say anything to my uncle. Not that day. Not that week. Instead, I started paying attention differently. I noticed that the evening tea was consistent. Same time, same cup, same ritual. I noticed my mother was clearest in the mornings, before the tea, and foggiest in the evenings after. I noticed that my uncle positioned himself between her and her phone when certain calls came through. I noticed that when I arrived unannounced on a Wednesday, the kitchen counter had been cleared of something before I reached it. I noticed the small lock on the door to what used to be my father's study. I stopped telling my uncle when I was coming. I started keeping notes, dates, times, observations, the kind of documentation that doesn't feel like evidence when you're collecting it and looks like a case file when you lay it all out. The second piece came from someone I almost didn't talk to. I joined an online forum for adult children managing aging parents, not because I thought I'd find anything useful, just because I needed somewhere to put the weight of what I was carrying. I posted vaguely about a family member overstepping with finances. Within an hour, 3 women had responded with their own versions. One of them asked me to private message her. Her name was Denise. She was 51. She lived in another state. Her story was different in the details and identical in the shape: a relative who entered after a loss, who made themselves necessary, who introduced a supplement routine, who began accumulating access to financial instruments. She'd caught it late. By the time she understood what was happening, 2 accounts had been drained and a transfer had been made that took 18 months to partially reverse. She connected me to a small network. Not a formal organization, just women who had been through it and stayed in contact. One of them had a background in elder law. One had documentation going back years. One had already seen a man with my uncle's particular set of patterns face consequences in a civil proceeding. Not enough, she said, but something. When I described my uncle, the woman with the legal background got quiet. Then she asked me 3 specific questions about the trust document, the supplement timing, and whether my mother had been seen by her own physician independently in the past 6 months. The answer to all 3 told her everything she needed. This has a name, she said, and it has a process. She walked me through it without pressure. She told me what to document, who to contact, what to keep, and what not to move. She told me that the joint trust, while alarming, was actually useful. It created a paper trail that a competent attorney could use. She told me not to confront him directly, not yet, because confrontation shifts behavior and makes the pattern harder to prove. Let him keep going, she said. He'll do the work for you. I found an attorney through a referral from my college friend's title company colleague. I met with her twice before I said my uncle's name out loud to anyone outside that forum. She was methodical. She didn't use words like shocking or outrageous. She said things like actionable and demonstrable pattern, and this is exactly the kind of case that doesn't settle quietly. She also told me something important. She said that because my mother hadn't been formally assessed for cognitive capacity at the time of the trust signing, There was a meaningful legal argument that the document was executed under conditions that compromised her informed consent. She used the phrase undue influence. She said she'd seen this before. I asked her how many times. She looked at me steadily. More than I'd like, she said. Meanwhile, I kept visiting on Sundays. I kept my voice warm and my face open, and I let my uncle believe that I was exactly what he needed me to be grateful. A little naive, too busy to dig. He started getting comfortable in a way that made things easier. He mentioned a financial advisor he'd been working with, someone who could help consolidate my mother's accounts for simplicity. He mentioned updating the beneficiary designations on 2 policies just to keep everything organized. He mentioned once that my mother had mentioned wanting to put the house on the market at some point, just to simplify things, just to have the liquidity. He mentioned this while my mother sat at the kitchen table and stared at her tea. I nodded. I said that sounded practical. I asked him a few gentle clarifying questions that I already knew the answers to. I watched him explain things with the patience of someone who believes they're the smartest person in the room, and I thought about the attorney's voice on the phone 2 days earlier. "We're ready when you are." The moment I knew it had to be now came on a Thursday evening. I'd stopped by without calling ahead, a habit I'd developed over the previous 6 weeks. My uncle's car was in the driveway, but the house was quiet. I let myself in with my key. My mother was in the living room, sitting in my father's chair, and there was a man I didn't recognize at the dining room table with a briefcase and a folder. My uncle was standing behind my mother's chair with his hand on her shoulder and a pen extended toward her. I stood in the doorway. My uncle saw me, and something moved across his face calculation, mostly. Then the smile. He said, "Claire, great timing. Your mom's just taking care of some paperwork." I looked at the man with the briefcase. "Are you a notary?" He confirmed that he was. I looked at the folder on the table. "What is she signing?" My uncle started to explain something about updated beneficiary designations, really just a formality. The attorney had reviewed everything, and I walked to the table and picked up the top sheet before he could redirect me. It was a durable power of attorney. Immediate, comprehensive, granting my uncle full authority over every financial and medical decision my mother might need made. My mother's hand was already resting near the signature line. I looked at the notary. "Do you have documentation of her capacity assessment?" He blinked. "Before a document like this is executed," I said, "best practice is a physician's statement confirming that the signer understands what she's agreeing to and is doing so voluntarily. Do you have that?" He did not have that. "Then I'd recommend we pause," I said, "until we do." My uncle's hand tightened on my mother's shoulder. He said my name in a tone I recognized, the one that meant he was deciding how much force to apply. I looked at him directly. I didn't look away. I said my mother's physician should be present before anything was signed, and I said it in a voice that made it clear I would not be moved from that position. The notary, to his credit, began closing his folder. My uncle waited until the notary had left, and my mother had gone to lie down before he turned to me. He wasn't shouting. He was the opposite of shouting, quiet and precise, and cold in a way that the loud version would never be. He said I didn't understand how much work he'd been doing. He said I had no idea what it cost to manage something like this, to give up months of his own life, to put his own finances on hold. He said that all he had wanted was to make sure my mother was cared for, and that I was sabotaging something my father would have wanted. He said my father trusted him. I let him finish. Then I told him that I had spoken with an attorney, that I had copies of the deed transfer, that I had logs of the supplement timing and my mother's cognitive pattern, that I had spoken with other women who could describe, in documentation, how this same sequence of events had unfolded in their own families. I told him that the conversation he'd just had with me would be the last one we had without witnesses. He went very still. Then he said I was making a serious mistake. Then he said we could work this out privately. Then he said, and this is the part I will remember clearly for the rest of my life, that families handled these things internally, and that going outside would hurt my mother more than it would help her. I told him the truth didn't need his permission. I left the house. 3 hours later, I was on the phone with my attorney. The following 9 days were the most focused I have ever been. My attorney coordinated with Adult Protective Services. A physician, my mother's actual doctor, not anyone my uncle had selected, conducted a proper cognitive assessment. The results confirmed what I had suspected. Her presentation was consistent with someone who had been administered sedating compounds over an extended period. Not a formal diagnosis yet, but enough to establish that her capacity during the trust signing was legitimately in question. The deed transfer was flagged for review. The financial advisor my uncle had been working with was contacted. 2 of the accounts had already had ownership modifications submitted but not yet processed. They were frozen before anything moved. My uncle, apparently sensing that the walls were closing, booked a flight. He told he needed to handle something in another state. He packed 2 bags. He called no one in the family. He booked a one-way ticket. He was stopped at the gate. I wasn't there. My attorney told me about it the following morning. She described it with the same precision she used for everything: the officers, the moment, the expression on his face when he realized that the folder he'd carried through security contained documents that were already evidence. She said he'd tried to explain twice before he stopped talking. She said it was quiet, which is the way these things should end. My mother was moved into a short-term care facility while the medical team assessed the full picture. Within 10 days, the fog lifted noticeably. Her doctor used careful language compound interactions, consistent with sedative overexposure, but the outcome was not careful at all. She called me one morning from her room and talked for 45 minutes without losing a single thread. She cried when she understood what had happened. She cried harder when I told her it was over. The legal proceedings moved in the way legal proceedings do, not fast, not loudly, but with a weight that doesn't bend. The trust was dissolved. The deed transfer was reversed. 2 of the accounts had been partially drawn down. The financial institution's fraud division opened a parallel investigation that I hadn't expected and didn't need to manage. More women came forward once his name entered the record, 3 from other states. Their stories were different in address and year and victim. They were identical in architecture. He was charged with elder financial exploitation, fraud, and 2 counts related to the pharmaceutical situation. His attorney negotiated. It didn't help as much as his attorney suggested it would. He was sentenced to 7 years. The property was fully restored to my mother's name. The drawn-down accounts recovered approximately 60% through civil action. Not everything, but enough to matter. My mother came home to a house that was hers again. The first thing she did was open every window. She told me later that she'd known something was wrong but hadn't been able to hold the thought long enough to act on it. She said it felt like trying to read in a moving car. The words were there, but they kept sliding. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I told her that people who do this choose their moments and their targets carefully, and that being chosen doesn't mean you failed. She hung a photo in the hallway the week she came home. Just the 2 of us, taken years before any of this. She chose the spot herself, without asking anyone. I went back to work. Different rhythms. I started reading more carefully about financial exploitation of older adults, not obsessively, but as preparation. I connected with a local advocacy group. I started talking to people who needed someone to explain the signs, to help them understand what they were seeing before it became something that needed undoing. Not because I wasn't still afraid sometimes, but because I know what it costs to stay quiet, and I know what it takes to stop. My uncle thought he had walked into a family in mourning and found an opening. What he found instead was a woman who knew how to read a document, ask a question, and wait. The house where I grew up is quiet now. My mother calls me every morning. She's been sleeping through the night for 4 months. She has her own physician, her own attorney, her own accounts that she checks herself. She asked me to teach her how to read a property record, so I did. Some betrayals look like emergencies. They come loud and sudden and leave obvious damage. But the kind that starts with an offer to help, with a cup of tea, with a sympathetic hand on your shoulder, that kind does its work slowly and in silence. And by the time you see it clearly, it has already been happening for a long time. I'm telling this because I spent months thinking I was imagining things. I second-guessed myself every time I found something that didn't add up. I told myself I was being unfair to someone who had given up time to help our family. If any part of this sounds familiar, you are not being unfair. You are being accurate. Trust what you notice. Write it down. Find one person who will listen without telling you you're wrong. And if someone in your life is controlling the information, the access, or the routine of someone you love that is the thing you look at first, it's not too late to look.